Hello. The title of my project is East African Slave Trade. The purpose of the project is to introduce to a wider audience the history of the East African slave trade. While the slave trade in the Atlantic Ocean is widely publicized, the East African slave trade is widely ignored. Through the items I have exhibited, I want to show various aspects of the East African slave trade and highlight how it differs from the Atlantic slave trade, and also show how the public fails to address this part of history. The key challenge I had was finding material that fit my topic and told the complete story. I ran into the problem that most of the written resources were British. Relying on only British sources would only tell a very small portion of the story. So I had to find items that addressed the perspectives of the sub-Saharan Africans and the Arabic Muslim traders. I needed to show both the trade in slaves, but also where these slaves ended up. So I also needed material showing where these captives were going and what they had to do once there. For my first item, I am displaying a map called the African Slave Trade, which discusses the slave trade between the times 1500 and 1870. As you can see, it depicts the African slave trade, mainly focusing on the West African trade. The size of the arrows reflect the volume of slaves transported. I chose this map because it is centered on the Atlantic slave trade, while also depicting a portion of the Indian Ocean trade. The map is purposely called the African slave trade, not the Atlantic slave trade, but it still chooses to largely ignore the East African slave trade. This is possibly because the Atlantic trade had a much greater volume of slaves transported in the short amount of time than in East Africa. As you can see, the arrows are much larger in the West African trade, but much smaller in the East African trade. The difference is that in the East African trade, the trade in slaves lasted for a much longer period of time, while in the West African trade it was a much shorter period of time, but a larger volume of slaves in that short period of time. But in the end, when you total the number of slaves for each trade, they come out about equal. So overall, they did trade in about the same number of slaves in both the East African slave trade and the West African slave trade. So, another item I have displayed is called Male Servants in Egypt. This is an image of an African slave serving as a domestic servant for the two Egyptian women, who are shown here. The purpose of this image is to showcase where the captives of the East African slave trade ended up. Most captives in the East became domestic servants, unlike in the West, where most worked in agriculture. Being in a Muslim Arabic country, Egypt was one very possible destination for captives. But captives also went to other Arabic states, as well as Asia and the islands in the Indian Ocean, including Zanzibar. A small portion were eventually sent to the Americas as well, specifically Brazil, after the trade in West Africa was banned by the British. One thing to note is that the servant skin is depicted as much darker than the skin of the Egyptians. Part of this purpose of this distinction is because the Arabic Muslims viewed sub-Saharan Africans as inferior because of their darker skin. So the next item we will be looking at is called Stone Town in Zanzibar. So right here we have a web page from Zanzibar.net. This is a travel website advertising the Stone Town in Zanzibar. What makes this webpage so interesting is how they deal with advertising this historical site, which was directly involved in the East African slave trade. This historical site was actually declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Even though these historical buildings were built and used by the very Arabic Muslims trading in African slaves, and were being used as part of that trade, there is no mention of slavery anywhere on this page. They do mention the Indian Ocean trade, but that is the closest they get to talking about the slave trade. Rather than address this difficult history, they simply chose to ignore it. This very attitude is part of the reason the East African slave trade is not very well known. The next item that I will be addressing is called The Muslim Slave Raid on a Village, Central Africa, Early 1880s. This image depicts Arabic Muslim slave raiders shooting the African men with guns. The African men have spears and shields, so they are no match for the raiders' firepower. Behind the raiders you can see women and children, captives, being tied at the neck and transported for the slave trade. The purpose of this image is to show how Muslim slave traders generally obtained captives, as well as the nature of the relationship between Arabic Muslims and Sub-Saharan Africans. This relationship was based on violence and coercion. So the final item I will be looking at is on the second page, and it is called the East African Slave Trade, Slavery in Zanzibar. This item is a video off of YouTube, and this video discusses Tipu Tip and his involvement in the slave trade of Zanzibar, which was a major center for the East African slave trade. It describes the poor treatment of slaves while they were being held before they were sold. It also describes how Zanzibar continued the slave trade after it was banned in the West. I used this video to show the actual trade of Africans in the East, how that process worked, and how it is incredibly horrific, similar to the horrifying stories we hear about the West African slave trade. What makes this video even more interesting is the end of the video, where the woman talking is discussing David Livingstone. David Livingstone did stay for a short period of time in Zanzibar, and he wrote about denouncing the slavery and the slave trade that he saw going on in Zanzibar. He actually wanted the English government to ban slavery in this area so that they could stop the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. So this woman is discussing Livingstone and how he denounced slavery and was trying to stop the East African slave trade. She praises him for this effort, and she also goes on to praise England as a whole for denouncing slavery and trying to end it in the East. And she praises the West for ending slavery in the West before the East African slave trade had ended. So this part of the video paints the Arabic Muslims as barbaric and ignores that the role England played in the West African slave trade was just as, if not more, horrific. Although the East African slave trade needs to be more publicized, it should not be used to try to establish a Western superiority simply because the slave trade in the East occurred for a longer period of time. In conclusion, the East African slave trade is ignored far too often. It is a significant part of world history, and the public should try to better know and understand it, as it does with the Atlantic slave trade. The slave trade in the East did not transport as many Africans as the West in one time, but it did have a significant impact on the African continent. A lot of this had to do with the violent and racist way Arabic Muslims dealt with Sub-Saharan Africans. The Atlantic slave trade and East African slave trade had a lot of differences, but both involved violent coercion. Both had a significant impact on world history, and Both needed to be appropriately publicized to increase our understanding of our history. Thank you.